Grounded makes me feel small. Obviously it does have been shrunk down to the size of an ant. Well, there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Jokes aside, if you clicked on this video, it's probably for one of two reasons. You either like the game and want to hear someone yap about it, or you've seen the title and thumbnail and had no idea what point I was going to try and make, considering the obvious reasons to why you'd feel small in a game where you're the size of an ant. But with Grounded, there is more to it. Have you ever started playing an open world game and got to that point where the world is revealed to you and you just gaze at the landmarks? Then you open the map and whether it's revealed on the first look or shrouded by a fog that masks its true identity, you can see the size of it. You zoom out, move your cursor around and think, this is massive. And because of its overwhelming size, it can give the illusion that your character is a very small part of this giant world. In Grounded, the opening is the opposite. You awake from a regular briefcase with 4 teen-sized slots as you jump out into a small crater in the ground. As you walk out and the open world is revealed, all you see is grass towering over you and the huge tree towering over it. It's easily determined that you aren't a small part of this giant world, but the opposite. This world is giant because you are small. But it doesn't stop there, as there's more world building and details that can keep the player engaged with this belief and keep you immersed. This game takes the open world concept and flips it, and with this video I'm going to explain how Grounded makes you feel small. Wait a second, before we go any further, I must warn that this video was on a game with a lot of bugs, including spiders, so if you have any fears or anything then take this as your warning. There'll also be some spoilers for the game, and if by the end you enjoyed the video, a like would greatly help the channel, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content from me. That's all, enjoy. Grounded is a survival game in which you play as one of 4 missing teenagers, but only real ones pick Pete. They've been a part of a science experiment which resulted in them being miniaturized and abandoned in a garden. Yeah, a garden. The aim of the game is to protect yourself with gear and take up arms with innocent ladybugs in order to find chips to restore this guy. His name is Burgle. He lost his memory in an explosion that you caused. Don't you feel bad now? He thinks the chips will help restore his memory and allow you to be normal sized once again, but he was designed to flip patties, so can you even trust him? Well, he's all you've got, so you're gonna have to. This all takes place in the garden. The garden is the main reason for making me feel small in the game, and it's not down to the map being big. In comparison to other maps in survival games or otherwise, it's relatively small. It being small is the exact reason I too feel small. The garden is obviously based off a real garden and things that you would normally find within one, besides infected bugs and robots, but you get the point. If our character was a normal size, then it might take maybe 10 seconds to walk across the map, but due to the size of us, it takes quite a bit longer. And looking around you can see inanimate objects that we can recognise, such as a bench for example, and yet it's so large we have to find ways to scale it without risking death. Or perhaps the oak tree, which yes will be big for anyone at any size, but seems so incredibly large given the scale at which it is compared to our experimented on teen. It's so large in fact that it can be used as a point of reference for moving around and locating areas without having to use the map. These unfathomably large objects are the exact size they would be anywhere else, and it brings on a sort of uncanny valley feeling when I really take my time to look and observe the map. One of the first moments in the game sees the player being given the objectives of fixing the laser and using the mysterious machine laid out in the garden. The machine is large enough for the player's tiny body to fit into small crevices and walk around on the motherboard inside, but the main thing we need to do is fix the lasers. There is one being blocked by a blade of grass. Once you find and craft the appropriate gear, that being an axe made of a pebble, you're able to chop this down, and it feels no different to chopping down a tree in a game like The Forest. But then you realise it's not a tree, it's literally grass. You can see water droplets collecting on it. You can see larger, heavier creatures are able to move the grass around like it's King Kong coming through the jungle trees, and yet you need to use tools to even put a dent into it. Grass doesn't curve or become weighed down if you stand on it or parkour across the blades, again putting into perspective that you are so small and light and the world around you is bigger. However, no more than normal. It's the same size as always to the perspective of a ladybug for example. The other laser is tweaking out and doesn't remain consistently on, so it's our duty to find out why and solve that problem. It turns out it was some pesky mites chewing on the power cable. The players must follow it and take out any critters mistaking the cable as a meal and put them out of their misery. In doing so, it shows the player the scale of the bugs in the garden, going as small as mites and showing that you're not even capable of withstanding damage from something so obsolete. On the other end of the size spectrum, spiders play the role of the early game monsters, the enemies you want to avoid at all costs. The level check to ensure the player has the best tools for that point in the game. The size of the spiders can seem so much larger than their real life counterparts, and yet their size is shown in their habitats. The first orb weaver the player is likely to encounter will be the group that reside in the plant garden, often between the small stumps of wood. Finding these areas of rest for them shows the player that this world isn't a bigger place than normal, and that they are still to scale with elements of the backyard. Another example would be the wolf spider. They can unfortunately be found very early on under the oak tree, sleeping away their days to prepare for the hunt when the moon rises. The tree is big anyway, so it can warp our sense of size, so a better example would be the not so little wolf spider that calls the head of an old broken action figure its humble abode. The difference with this one is that the head likely belongs to a toy that the teenager we play as may have played with at some point, which is now housing a beast of a spider that the player's life is threatened by, putting into perspective the true size of the spider, and worse, us. An interaction that comes from the spiders, the orb weavers specifically, is the webbing attack. Weavers will spit webs like Spider-Man imitating a spider and will get you hooked on that stuff like, okay, you're now immobile, prey waiting to be had, unless you can break free using a tool. Now do me a favour, next time you see a cobweb perhaps on your car's wing mirror, just swipe a single thread of it. You'll find it destroys all that hard work very quickly and with very little effort. Now imagine that same web being a trap that prevents you from moving away from the predator that laid it. It's like a sleep paralysis dream. You sit there terrified watching the demon crawl closer. It's hopeless. The idea of being tangled in a web is enough for any arachnophobe to comment on this video telling me of said phobia, but this giant is no giant. It was the same size before, it'll be the same size later. It is you who has become small. The predator has not adapted and outgrown its environment like a horrible piece of fiction depicting arachnids as human hunters, but instead a tale of fiction where those same small creatures have had the playing field levelled, the odds evened, odds even waging in their favour by making you the prey. To push the odds in your direction, you need to explore the garden. Burgle informs the player of super chips which not only push the narrative forward, but also give the player access to new equipment as well as new attire for their bases. But what are you exploring? Of course, it's biomes, and I personally think this is one of the best aspects of the game, and how the devs have took the stereotypical biomes of forests, swamps, a desert area, and managed to implement plenty of different biomes in one world, still based on a real garden, and it doesn't feel unnatural. It's quite the opposite. Let's start with the most basic in the game, the forest/woodland areas. Most survival based games have you start in an area with trees to break down to farm and begin building a base and your basic survival tools. Grounded has this, but as mentioned before, the trees are replaced with blades of grass to chop down, and most of the garden is covered in grass, so initially it seems like the world is pretty bland, but as you explore you come to realise that this isn't true at all. There are different variations of the forest biome, including the dried grass zones, which also add some different colour to the typical grass areas. You also have marshy swamps and areas growing weeds, but it's not all the game offers. There are underground biomes which can be accessed through anthills. Simply follow a worker ant back to their home and then you can go in, raid their home and take their offspring and turn them into bombs. What the hell is this game, man? But the underground biomes from other open world games are normally accessed through old wells or abandoned mines, diving into deep chasms or falling in by accident. But in a world where you are the anomaly, how can underground be implemented in a seamless way and without making the garden seem so unrealistic? Ants. And the game implements it really well. There's different tribes of ants claiming different underground tunnels, and following each will lead to their respective homes. Across the biomes are the labs the player needs to find and explore, and the first the player is likely to discover is the hedge lab. The hedge feels different from anywhere else in the world, with what feels like giant branches carving a path for you to your goal, or to your death if you decide to go a certain way, or if you fall like I did multiple times and forgot how to use my tuft. But this whole area is manipulated into seeming larger than it is. As mentioned, the branches you follow are most likely actually twigs, fragile thin sticks that we wouldn't think twice about being able to snap incredibly easily, and yet here we are, playing as a character that's able to walk on it, and no matter the tools, we're not able to deal a chip of damage to them. They can also seem much larger when you see the very small field station that's planted at the beginning of the trail. Comparing the size of the hedge to it and you start to believe you're exploring a huge area. But if you walk over to the right, where the larvae and beetles often sit, you can find two items that put the real size of the hedge into perspective, those being the Oreo cookie and the cassette tape. The cookie is something that the characters make jokes about eating back when they were the size of an actual human being, and yet now they're forced to eat tiny crumbs to suffice their hunger despite being the size of crumbs themselves. The cassette tape yet again just demonstrates how something small seems so large next to the player, and with it being so close to the hedge you can begin to recognise that the hedge is a normal size. Within it, the player is able to find the first lab and the first chip to hand to burgle. What they may also find is the Broodmother BLT, a food recipe for summoning a boss also found within the hedge. You can probably guess the name of it. As someone with a mild phobia of spiders, this place is awful. It's found just off the guided path of branches leading to the lab. As the player approaches it, it becomes abundantly clear that this place ain't good. As you enter, you see the bugs that you may have struggled to beat when you first started being strung up in webs, all kinds of ants, lava. Then the large arena is revealed with you and its true potential being shown, with ladybugs, stink bugs and bombardier beetle corpses all being strung like a sadistic demonstration of this predator's capabilities. The hedge is home to some spiderlings and there's orb weavers on the ground, so it wouldn't be stupid to assume that maybe this creature is just a beefed up orb weaver. But if the player brings the BLT and sets the bait, the real monster will reveal themselves. The Broodmother is a glimpse at the real bosses of the garden, the bugs that don't show themselves off but instead hunt their prey and stay in their lair whilst they grow, waiting to be found. Other bosses in the game include the Mantis and the Wasp Queen, both towering over the player. Much like the lair of the Broodmother, the Wasp Queen's arena is the detail that can make the player feel small. She resides within a hive within a bin. Finding your way into a hive is one thing given how small it would be to a normal sized peat, but having it placed within a bin also aids improving the size of the hive, garden, the creatures within, and most importantly, the player. Another biome that pleasantly surprised me was the idea to make a desert biome out of a sandbox. It's a biome that the player will come to later on in their survival journey and is home to some tough enemies that make some great gear. The typical desert biome would apply some kind of debuff to the character in other games, and here it is no different, with the player becoming more thirsty and requiring certain gear to offset the sizzle debuff, which will begin to slow and kill the player if left unchecked. By taking the common concept of sand burning your feet on hot days and using a common garden toy for kids and combining the two, they made what would seem like an impossible biome in a garden possible. The sand burning your feet and forcing you to find shade and water is a great implement that makes the player feel like they will be in an actual desert, but with the combination of items such as rubbish, including the core of an eaten apple, and sandpit tools and buckets, there's always a reminder that this isn't normal. But for me, the most important is the landmark of the area, the sandcastle. It's easy to forget that you're not just in a desert whilst roaming the sandy land. However, the sandcastle always made me think of times where I've been to the beach or been in a similar sandbox as a kid and played with those buckets that create a sandcastle. I've memories of trying to build the biggest one I can, and before I'd leave I'd either stomp it down ready for someone else to build it back up again or leave it to be consumed by the rising tide. Something I would have built as a kid is now a landmark in a game that not only towers over me as a player, but is also explorable. Again, it reminds me of the true reality of this uncanny valley situation where normal everyday objects seem so much larger, despite actually being normal, and it's the player being the one who is vertically challenged. It's okay, Short Kings, I'm with you. The wiki states that there are 13 biomes, but I just want to talk about a couple more. The first of which being the pond. The seemingly sea-sized pond is a natural water biome, and one of the main labs the player must explore is buried deep under the surface. I hated this place. Not just because of the horrible spiders that have adapted to the water, or despite feeling like I have to do so much just to be able to stand a chance under the surface, but because of something much, much bigger. So I was going through the game and decided to make a temporary base by the pond. I thought it'd be easy access to the oak tree, so why not? Whilst building a more permanent base above the water, I heard this. I ran so far thinking that maybe a wolf spider that was jacked as shit had picked up on my scent and began hunting me, but that would have been the best outcome. Instead, what I'd heard was the deep bellow of a marine animal, nay, a marine monster, nay, a kaiju level threat that lurked within the pond. When it came down to it and I had to get my size 0.5 centimeter feet wet, I was met with something that shook me, something I didn't expect to find. A leviathan-sized predator. All exaggeration aside, the koi fish is a lethal creature to come across if you find yourself within the vision of its one eye. It scours the pond searching for food, and if you just so happen to find yourself in its path, well, that's just unlucky. The koi fish feels like a genius move by the devs. They have at least one creature in the backyard that is able to kill the player instantly, a threat to always avoid and never try to take on. When I first played the game, I could have sworn the bird would have taken that role, since they normally feed on bugs and with the player being the size of one. But no, instead the koi fish fulfills that missing aspect, not only creating a creature that the player stands no chance against due to their size, but also leans into the idea of the ocean being a dangerous place. I could make an obvious reference to Subnautica's Leviathans here, but games like Jak 1 have a dangerous sea creature that will eat the player for swimming out of bounds. Stranded Deep has a Megalodon boss fight, and so many other games explore that concept of the ocean housing dangerous creatures that are almost untouchable by the player. But those games are either ocean based or include oceans within their levels. Grounded doesn't. Grounded is set in a backyard where normal things you or I wouldn't think twice about are now possible threats or obstacles for the teenagers to tackle. Adding the pond and the koi fish implements that watery horror that many hate, and the idea that the ocean is no joke. But the horror doesn't stop at the pond, because if you expected this game to conform to the standards of a normal back garden, you'd be wrong. The haze is a biome polluted by a weed-killing spray that is constantly leaking. I initially thought that this area would be free of bugs since they most likely wouldn't be able to survive it, but no. I don't know where these guys are buying their weed-killing chemicals, but this turns bugs into zombies. Not literally, but it's the closest you're gonna get to zombie bugs in a fictional world without having outright doing zombie bugs. The afflicted areas and bugs grow cordyceps-like fungi on them, causing them to become unstable and deal more damage, and always pose the threat of exploding. The haze is leaking from the canister, which can be reverted by clogging it up using a nugget of chewing gum. The decision is not mandatory, but instead provides the player with a choice. Keep the haze and its infected population isolated in this biome, or clog the canister, which will cause the noxious gas to dissipate. However, its occupants will begin to roam other biomes and the infection will spread. This can help the player to explore the caves and craters within the biome without the need of the gas mask. The biome contains a lot of resources used in upgrading your gear, however the downside being that the infected bugs can now be found across the yard. But what good are biomes without things to build in them? After all, this is a survival crafting game. You have quite a lot of freedom with where you want to build, and as you play and discover more things using science, you discover more things to craft. You could build a home or a fort using grass if you wanted to, but much like other games, there's a hierarchy of materials with better defensive capabilities and aesthetics of course. You can go from using grass blades to weed stems to mushrooms that you can smelt and harden to create a brick looking building material. As important as it is to have a stable and defensive home, you also need to be cozy within it to unlock more furniture and the like. You can make trampolines and basketball hoops should you feel the need to improve your gymnastics or NBA skills, and you can make interior stuff such as drawers and stuffed animals that you've mercilessly killed. Have fun snuggling up to your stuffed wolf spider. If berries were humans, then that makes you Ed Gein with the amount of furniture that you can make from them. Berries can be used to make a leather-like material which can then go into making things like chairs or a bed, but given how small the characters have been shrunk down to, berries would seem like quite the task to harvest, but with the help of gravity and a strong enough weapon, you can make it work. Berries are some of the largest resources in the game. Others include acorns, the petals of flowers, and the biggest thing you can find that I'm aware of are fallen feathers from the bird. Even then, the biggest resources that we can harvest aren't even that big. In the case of things like the acorn, can provide very strong armor for the player at least early on. But what's a home without a pet? And in Grounded, there's a couple of critters you can tame, including ants, gnats, weevils, and my favourite, the aphid. These little guys can help around the base and give your character some extra stats, which are nice, but let's be honest, it's just nice to have something that we can call a pet. But you can't keep your pets fed without feeding yourself. Of course, it's a survival game, so you need to manage your hunger and your thirst. With this comes more evidence to back up the size of the player, and it's actually when we take a look at the biology of the player that we see this. A typical person needs to drink around 2 to 2.5 litres of water per day. Pete or any of the other teens is only required to drink 3 droplets of water to stay fully hydrated. Let's be generous and say that the player goes from full hydration to dry 5 times a day. That would still only be 15 drop-sized drinks a day. The same is found with food. Pete and the gang can eat a few crumbs of food per day and be okay, in fact better than if they're full, gaining a boost in stamina. These details don't stand alone, there's a lot more that help immerse the player in this small world. One of my favourites, which seems so obvious to do but also is one of the most impactful, is having the distance between the player and a marker being measured in centimetres rather than metres. When you place a marker on the other side of the map, it can seem like you have a trek ahead of you, but then you see the marker saying 100 centimetres and you realise it's just over 3 of these bad boys. If you wish to fast travel across the map, then you're out of luck. Instead, you have to set up a system of zip lines if you wish to travel safer and quicker from biome to biome. You create the zip lines from spider webs, which brings it back round to the point I made earlier about the webs being easily breakable for us, but in game we are as helpless as a fly against how strong the webs can be. So strong in fact that we're able to glide back and forth on it. Even with a full inventory, the line doesn't even begin to dip. If you were to fall off it or fall whilst trying to scale up any of the larger environments around the yard, you would most likely cease to exist, since hitting the ground from a high height hurts real bad. Fortunately, there is one thing that can provide a slower descent, and that's the tuft of a dandelion. You know those things you'd see as a kid and think, what the fuck is that, and then you would blow it and it would fly around, or you'd eat it? That very thing is what helps a small teen safely land when falling to their death. There are some collectibles for the player to find, including the card system, which essentially acts as a bestiary, where you can spy out bugs in the world using your hands as a pair of binoculars, but an actual collectible that provides a jarring comparison between it and the player is the teeth found around the yard. Despite what I initially thought, they aren't real teeth. They're vitamin sweets for kids in the canon, and in-game provide the player with a boost in their stats should they successfully smash a tooth apart. Despite the fact they're not real teeth, they're still something that the characters we play as would have ate, and you find these all over the yard. There are other food items across the garden, but it's the milk molars that actually provide a benefit and constantly remind me of the size my character once was. But no matter if it's the labs, the creatures, the landmarks, or the points of interest, nothing comes close to making you feel small like the ending of the game. No matter if you get the good or the bad ending, the same scene plays out. You fix the shrinking machine and you go ahead and activate the spacer. The cutscene initially starts in third person, however swaps to first as the shift in size begins. This immerses you more so in the evolution, going from being a bug-sized teen to a teen-sized one. As you watch yourself grow back to your original size, you begin to see the world around you shrink. Everything seems so small now that you seem so large. The shed begins to look like you would barely fit into it. The pond looks like you could stand by it and watch the koi swim around. Even the oak tree doesn't seem that big compared to you now. For the first time, you're able to see over the walls that locked you in. You can see the roads, the trees and other houses. You were never just locked into this small map, but you were instead incapable of escaping. For that time playing, you felt what it feels like for a small bug to be locked in a large terrarium, but they could always see the outside world. But you could only see the top of trees and streetlights. The only other thing is picture mode. You can zoom out and your character is very clearly small compared to the surroundings and the environment, but I didn't want to cover that since the game is first person for the most part, and that sense of immersion is lost with the use of picture mode. Grounded is not only a great survival game, not only an immersive one, but also a great simulation of how the world around us would interact with us if we were the size of a small bug. From the very beginning of the game, the player is set with an objective: get big again. From that point to the very end, it immerses you in its world, with biomes that seem familiar yet so different, and between the small details and the large details, it begins to become clear that you are the anomaly. And once that objective is complete, you finally begin to see the world for what it actually is. Not a world at all, but a garden, a regular sized garden. It wasn't large, the oak tree wasn't even the biggest tree in sight, the koi fish wasn't an unstoppable monster, spiders weren't freakishly large. You were small. Brood mothers in real life are actually tiny though, so I guess the game is wrong. One of my favourites